We begin part two of our look at segregation with the example of redlining in Baltimore. Again, Baltimore is just one example of 239 cities that experienced the short and long-term effects of this de jure form of segregation. These laws that went in effect in 1937 again began to create opportunity for one group of people and limited opportunity for another. So if you lived in one of these red line neighborhoods, you were not able to invest in your own property, you were not to rehabilitate your own neighborhood, and because of your race or ethnicity, if you were of a minority race or ethnicity, you wouldn't be able to obtain a loan to move out of the area. So what we found in a lot of our cities was that areas that were green or yellow, or areas that were deemed low risk, would thrive, while these areas that were labeled in red would continue long-term drought, long-term lack of investment. So the patterns that were initially established in the 1930s persist through the second decade of the 21st century. And we can see here the scars of discrimination, the scars of segregation in the Baltimore city boundaries, where the areas of black populations became the areas that were redlined beginning in the 1930s through the 1960s. You see what's known as the black butterfly, where East and West Baltimore are predominantly, overwhelmingly black, where the center of Baltimore, down through the waterfront area of Federal Hill and Locust Point and Fort McHenry, are overwhelmingly white. So when we look at segregation, we see how a tool, a legal tool like redlining, could separate our population. As redlining expanded northwest and northeast out of the downtown area, those areas became pockets of less investment. They also became areas through the late 1960s where residents, primarily minority residents, weren't able to leave. They weren't able to obtain financing to move into the new suburbs. So in the 1960s, when the laws changed, we saw more opportunity evolve, but we also saw that culture is oftentimes slower to catch up. So despite 50 plus years into equal housing in different civil rights associated with the housing market, we see a continuation of segregation in our cities. One of the areas where we're going to pick up later in this lecture with gentrification looks at what happens when gentrifying areas welcome outside, more affluent groups. Oftentimes we have a period of integration, but then long term we see the return to segregation. So even as some of these neighborhoods may change from predominantly black or predominantly white to integrated, over time we're seeing that won't last. So again, despite de jure segregation, laws that separated our population based on race and ethnicity, despite those laws being overturned, we still have a very slow integration process. So 50 plus years into this housing reform, we're seeing patterns of segregation that reflect patterns of segregation under the period of legal segregation. And our final example of segregation comes from the case study in the QB reading, looking at Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland is an example of religious, ethnic, and political alliances and how that leads to division. The images on your screen show a map of the island of Ireland, with Northern Ireland represented by the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom, where the rest of Ireland is reflected by the Republic of Ireland's flag. The image on the left is of an IRA agent, an Irish Republican Army, and the level of separation and social distance and antagonism grew so deep between the Catholic Republicans and the Protestant Loyalists that paramilitary groups began to evolve. There was a paramilitary group on the Catholic side known as the IRA, and there was also a unionist paramilitary group that operated outside of the legal bounds of the United Kingdom's police and military force. When we step back a little bit, we see how this whole process evolved. Back in the 1500s and the 1600s, the United Kingdom began to acquire land on the island of Ireland, acquire through conflict, and they established what were known as plantations. Now, these plantations aren't like the plantations that we look at that exist today or existed in the times of slavery in the United States. These plantations reflect the actual planting, relocating of loyalists, individuals from the United Kingdom, into this part of the island and taking a land away from the ethnic Irish and giving it to the loyalists, those that were loyal to the crown in the United Kingdom. So these plantations took land away from the majority group, much like apartheid did in South Africa. So over time, the controlling group, the outside group of the United Kingdom, began to acquire land, began to acquire wealth, began to acquire better jobs, and created a stratified social hierarchy where the loyalists, those from the United Kingdom, were at the top and the ethnic Irish were at the bottom. So this setup persisted for centuries. And as you can imagine, for the ethnic Irish, for centuries of an unequal system, a separate but an unequal system, where they saw, particularly in the North, the loyalists, those that were associated with the United Kingdom, thrive, while the individuals that had a historic tie to the land suffered. This created a great divide. It led to a revolution or a war in the early 1900s in 1916 that ultimately led to what's known as the Partition of Ireland, where the North became separated, remained with the United Kingdom, and the South became the Republic. This was an appeasement, but it didn't sit well because, again, the Irish wanted the entire island under the Republic of Ireland. So for about 30 years, this led to a period called the Troubles, where these paramilitary forces that were previously mentioned would engage in conflict. A lot of the conflict took the form of car bombings, assassinations, pub bombings, not an outright war, but a lot of covert actions. Over the last 20 plus years, there has been an uneasy peace where throughout the year there are periods of increased tension, but the most part we've seen a decline in conflict, we've seen disarmament of the paramilitary groups, and we've seen a trend towards peace, but not necessarily integration. Today, de facto segregation remains very strong in Northern Ireland. Here's an image of a car bombing in the 1970s, bombing by the Irish Republican Army. They would often go after politicians and highly visible individuals that were loyal to the crown in the United Kingdom. When we look at the cultural landscape of Northern Ireland, we see images like the IRA. This would be an Irish Catholic neighborhood that is showing their desire for a one Ireland, showing a desire for what they would consider to be occupiers to leave that part of the country. Every summer there are what called orange parades that go through Belfast. And in this map on your screen, you could see areas that are primarily Catholic and areas that are primarily Protestant. Like our previous map of the Black Butterfly, these areas are predominantly one or the other. There's very little integration in Belfast. So the orange parades, which celebrate the United Kingdom's conquest of Ireland in the 1600s, those parades further divide these groups. So as the Protestant group celebrates and brags about their win from the 1600s and marching through parts of these Catholic neighborhoods, it increases the divide, it roils tensions. And with many of these parades in the evening, there are fires, there's conflict, there's rioting and looting, again because one group has been repressed, has received little value, little benefit as they've watched that other group grow for generations. Images of the Orange Parade. So if you're a Republican, if you're an Irish Catholic, witnessing what you would consider occupiers walking through your neighborhoods celebrating a centuries-old victory that has led to centuries of unequal opportunity, you could see how a parade like this would really roil tensions. women here are wearing the red and white of the English flag and carrying the Union Jack purses, right? Something that seems relatively innocent, just a demonstration of pride. Certainly it is for the group of loyalists, but for the Irish Republicans and the Irish Catholics, this is seen as a symbol of oppression. So when these women parade through their neighborhood, again, it roils tension, it increases divide. Here's an image of a group of police taking a proactive measure to limit uprising in the evening of one of these parades. In the background, you could see what's known as a peace wall with iconography of an Irish Catholic soldier in front of the post office in Dublin. Post office in Dublin became a symbol of the revolution that separated the Republic of Ireland from Northern Ireland. And when we look at images like this, again, oftentimes we see it as a symbol of pride, a symbol of culture. What we're recognizing in Northern Ireland is that our kids are becoming increasingly distant. So that index of dissimilarity that we looked at earlier in the United States, when we apply that to Northern Ireland, we actually see that the Loyalist Protestants and the Catholic Republicans are becoming more and more dissimilar. They're separating, they're interacting less as the kids are going to different schools. And that's becoming an increasing concern in Northern Ireland as the Protestant Union or the Protestant Loyalists are sending their kids to one school and the Irish Republicans are sending their kids to another school. And throughout the neighborhoods, we see that it's not only cultural separation, but the growth of what are known as peace walls are creating physical separation of the group. So again, as these groups become increasingly segregated, both socially and physically, the expectation that they're going to come together is, I mean, it's more of a hope than it is any kind of plan. So while the peace walls may actually separate groups for short-term peace, long-term, when you have two groups that are not physically or culturally coming together, the idea that they're going to work together is, I mean, it's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. So whether it is individuals in groups in Northern Ireland, whether it's individuals in groups in the United States, if we create these physical and cultural walls, there's no chance we're going to come together. We're only going to further increase our divide. Here's a couple images of peace walls in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and you could see, again, the iconography of this part of the country. You can see, you know, what these symbols mean when we're looking at the Ulster Defense Union. This was the paramilitary group that supported the Loyalists, supported the connection with the United Kingdom. You could see again just the physical imposing presence of these peace walls with barbed wire fence at the top and this steel wall that'll open up for a few hours of the day to support commerce but close up at night when businesses close. So what's happening in Northern Ireland, again, is just one example of what happens when we separate groups of people. Now, one group, the Loyalists, the Protestants, those associated with the United Kingdom, for centuries have had the benefit, have had the increased opportunities at the expense of the Irish Catholic Republicans. While the paramilitary action, the violence is calmed, we're not seeing much integration. We're not seeing these groups overcome the divisive forces and create an integrated Northern Ireland with more cultural solidarity. So we're seeing that social distance persist through these different de facto measures.